folks, we're back for another one of our series on Benny Goodman in 1935. We're in the midst of the Thesaurus sessions. We're working our way through 4 tunes at a time. I want to introduce my friends from Searcy, Arkansas, drummer Hal Smith. From San Francisco, California, Nick Rossi. Nick plays the guitar and other plectral instruments, and Hal is a percussionist with an emphasis on jazz drums. I play saxophone and piano, and the three of us are just going through session by session, remarking upon the music, for the most part, not getting into many of the other areas of research that surround these things, discography and certain aspects of Benny's biography and all that kind of stuff. We're pretty much going session to session, talking about it, A, through the vantage point of the rhythm section, and B, just the arrangements and the time in general. We're having a lot of fun, and so glad that you could join us again. The personnel of the band here: Ralph Musillo, Pee Wee Irwin, and Nate Casebeer on the trumpets, Jack Lacey and Red Ballard on trombones. The reed section: Toots Mondello, Jaime Schertzer on altos, Dick Clark and Art Rollini on the tenors, and various other woodwinds and flutes and stuff like that. Frank Froba on piano, Alan Roos on guitar, Harry Goodman on bass, and Gene Krupa on the drums. And they got together on June 6, 1935. And if you've heard the previous episodes, we've gone through several times what these transcriptions are. But simply put, they were music that was meant to be played on the radio only. They were not for sale, and they did not come out under Benny Goodman's name. But they're contemporaneous with the other well-known Victor recording sessions that the Goodman Band was making at the time. So that's what these recordings are. So now we go to Spud Murphy's arrangement of At the Darktown Strutters Ball. 1935, Spud Murphy at the Darktown Strutters Ball. And I don't even know where to begin with that. I can't wait to hear what you guys have to say about it, because it was like having a spotlight right in the rhythm section. You could hear it so clearly, and they did so many things. But just real quick, in some of the previous episodes, we were talking about Spud Murphy sometimes writing, not being like a chameleon, but writing in different styles. In other words, Fletcher Henderson really did one thing. Jimmy Mundy did one thing. Gordon Jenkins tended to do one thing. Benny Carter kind of did one thing. Spud Murphy's kind of all over the place. And sometimes, and he was probably very important to Benny at this time, because, Benny was doing all different kinds of gigs and had to have kind of a wide library. So, but here, Murphy's not doing like we heard him do previously, kind of a commercial opening chorus and then opening up the valve, because it's a jazz tune at Darktown Strutters Ball. Had already been around for almost 20 years at this point. And it's just a wonderful jazz arrangement with these little breaks for 4 instruments, I guess: clarinet, trumpet, tenor, maybe a trombone in there. I'm not sure. It might just be the 3. I'm pretty sure it's just the 3. And I love those. Those are a hallmark of his arrangements. And the voicing and the way that the 3 instruments go, it's always fascinated me. And on the later air checks from 1937 of this track, I think they stick to what was written for those breaks. And here they're kind of improvising in those breaks, similar in a certain sense to some of the breaks in Down South Camp Meeting, which sometimes the guys would go for their own, sometimes they'd do it as written. But this is a hell of a preamble, isn't it? But I just want to share one funny moment that actually happened with Benny. In the period when he was had just taken over my band in 1984-85, and we were rehearsing and figuring out what we were going to play, I pulled this chart out of the library, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind if we could just play it once. Because it wasn't just me, some of the other guys in the band too wanted to hear some of the more esoteric things, because we were doing pretty much all Fletcher Henderson, which is wonderful, but we wanted to hear some of the other things too. I pulled this chart out. I have a recording of it somewhere, and there's a part there at the end with the 4 clarinets in the band and Benny playing woo, with the chord, and he's playing along, and then he got to that part where all the clarinets do the anticipation beat, and he kind of put his clarinet up in the air like this, and we all went like this, and he started cracking up. He couldn't finish playing. He thought it was so funny, that particular effect. Maybe it seemed dated to him. I don't know what it was. But anyway, so there you go. But I'd love to hear from the rhythm section. What do you hear? What do you know? As Paulie Walnut said in The Soprano.
Well, I once again want to point out how relaxed Roos on the guitar sounds in this recording. It's driving. There's propulsion to the beat, but as we've heard on a couple other sides on this thesaurus session, he's a lot more relaxed than I think he's kind of often thought of as a player. Harkening it back a little bit to George Van Epps, and while I talked a little bit about Van Epps' politeness being a bit of kind of a negative in George's playing on some of these Benny sides, I think this is a good example of how that approach can affect the rhythm feel and modernize, if you will, in a 1935 sense, what the rhythm section feels like. It very much feels like the Benny Goodman rhythm section. Even though, again, the band had only been playing together for a few months, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. So I really liked that. I liked hearing some more kind of mid-tone pitched voicings on his guitar chords. Again, like not too high up, not too low down, so that it's lost in the mix. And the way he plays with Harry Goodman and the way Harry Goodman plays with Alan Roos is just, again, it's really commendable. They were a real good guitar and bass pairing, which so often is such a crucial part of a rhythm section when talking about this music and this era of this music. And mostly for me, it was just it was such a great support structure for a lot of wonderful Gene Krupa drumming.
Right. some very, very good general comments there. Not to pick apart words, but I think in the previous episode I kind of caught myself with certain adjectives I use, and so I'm going to ask you about one. What's the opposite of polite? Because you keep saying that
Aggressive.
George Van Epps is polite, so you're either polite or aggressive.
Well,
Because
yeah,
polite seems like something that you would want to be polite,
sure.
and aggressive has kind of a negative connotation. So I'm just curious. And again, the reason I'm getting into this, and I have to say mea culpa here, because I've already caught myself on it in previous episodes, and I question myself, which is part of my heritage, But getting, but getting into it, the reason that I dissect the adjective sometimes is that, of course, I know what you mean. Hal knows what you mean, and I assume that some of the people watching this know what you mean. Especially the younger players and the younger people with nothing to call upon of experience. They might say, well, man, he was polite and the other guy was aggressive. Aggressive seems almost negative, and polite seems like something that everyone would want to be. So can you dig down into it a little bit more?
Well, I think maybe assertive is probably a better word to position against polite. And when I say polite, I think about when a guitarist or any instrumentalist runs down a chart for either the first time or knowing that they're not, it's not a showpiece, or maybe that they're not going to be playing it again, or it's set number 3 of the night and you're playing, a tune that's a lesser light, and you put in a performance that is professional, and you put in a performance that is musical, but at the same time you don't take chances, you don't push too far forward here or there.
And that's George Van Epps?
And that's I think what I'm hearing on a lot of the George Van Epps recordings.
Okay.
I don't want to use the word perfunctory, but it's a professional but devoid of risks, or there's not a lot of risks there. At the same time, we heard several recordings with George where he clearly stepped in and kind of laid down the rhythmic law, where it was, this is where the beat is. Mm-hmm. And perhaps, like I say, perhaps assertive is a better way to characterize that, of evaluating the rhythmic need in the moment and kind of stepping up to it, if you will. And I
also
think,
be. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Loren.
It could also be giving Benny what he wanted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for that. It's these musicians clearly were not, playing in a vacuum. They weren't, they were musicians all in the same room, making this music at the same time, having discussions about it. I think what we talked about with the difference between George and Alan Roos is, from the get-go, there's kind of no questioning where Alan Roos's beat is, and there's no questioning his kind of role in the rhythm section. So I'm gonna stick with assertive as my my word to play off of.
That's fine.
George's politeness.
Fine. Well, yeah, and again, it's just. It's just finding myself surrounded by very young students sometimes, who I'm going to recommend this series to, and I'm sure some of yours too, and making sure that they can understand the terms that we use, and of course we understand what we mean. Also, I think it's also a function of Benny. Well, look, and now we'll go to Hal. Of course, we'll talk about Sammy Weiss and Gene Krupa, and the kind of player that Benny was, and that obviously Benny wanted. Bring it. He didn't want, which was fine too. So anyway, Hal, where are you on all this?
I love that arrangement because it never went where you thought it was going to go. It was all over the map. Each chorus was a totally different feel than the previous one, and that little spot in the middle with the reduced size band, the little Dixieland band, kind of foreshadows the Bobcats and the Clambake 7, doesn't it? And especially the drumming with Gene hitting a cowbell on the tom-tom and the rims and cymbal splashes, very much like Dave Tuff with the Clambake 7 and Ray Baduke with the Bobcats. And that's unusual for Gene Krupa. I don't hear that a lot on live performances or his commercial records, except for that crazy break on Don't Be That Way at Carnegie Hall. That's one of the few really outside breaks that he played. And also noticed he played on the, sounded like the snare drum rim on a couple of choruses there. Right? Yes, and later on in the arrangement as well. Doesn't sound like the bass drum shell. It doesn't sound like the bass drum rim. It sounds like the snare drum rim to me. But that's something that he hardly ever did after his time in Chicago and the recordings with Red Nichols. I can't think of offhand any other Benny Goodman sessions where he played that, but it's an interesting way to start. Okay.
I got one. I think it's the Sensation Rag from the Carnegie Hall concert, where they do the ODJB tune. And there he almost does like a
Tony Sparborough.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But that was a demonstration. That wasn't just part of a normal arrangement. That's what I meant. It's kind of unusual to hear him play that. Also, I noticed he played ride cymbal at one point, and we were talking about his ride cymbal playing and the types of cymbals he played, the diameter and all that. Also, I think one thing that affected his sound was when he played it, he reached his arm straight out and played like that, as opposed to modern drummers who tilt the cymbals over and play like that. You get a totally different sound if the cymbal is flat and able to move around on the stand versus somewhat cut off by being tilted. You get more of a pingy sound out of that. That's early to hear a ride cymbal on record for a whole chorus like that. It's fascinating. And he played at the very end a small crash cymbal wide open, just muting it at the very end of the crash as he played on The World's Waiting for the Sunrise with Jeff Stacey. That's how he ended the song. So he built the performance up, stepped it down a little bit, and built it back up and really went out with a bang. Yeah. That was a fantastic recording for the drums.
Yeah. Is that a Zooty Singleton thing more than the other drummers from Chicago with the shh, shh, shh on the out chorus, or was that something that was kind of common to a lot of the drummers of the era?
No, most of the drummers I'm familiar with would choke the cymbal off, so it goes as opposed to not let it ring like that. Like Willie the Weeper on the last chorus with Louis Armstrong's Hot 7, Baby Dodds is choking the cymbal off. You just generally don't hear it ring like that. It works better as the fidelity got better in recordings. You could hear more of the drums, and that's when you hear more cymbals. It wasn't a suspended cymbal that you hit with a mallet and it went pock, and no ring whatsoever. By this time, it would pick up whatever you did on a cymbal, so we can really hear what's being done. But that old-fashioned way of playing, that's how the New Orleans players played. If you see a film of Zooty playing, he's holding his hand straight out. The photos I've seen of Baby Dodds, he's playing like that. Ray Baduke, all the older players, Ben Pollock, like that. And it's a totally different sound than what we'd hear about 10 years later when the cymbals started tilting over and they got more pingy sounding.
Yeah. By the way, thank you very much. Nick and Hal and I are exchanging voluminous emails and photos and things in between these sessions. It's really, really wonderful. And one of the things that you shared yesterday, Hal, that Nick and I saw was the Bob Crosby Soundy or Vitaphone short, I guess it is, or something like that, from 1938, with some great Ray Baduke, and rare for the era, a Ray Baduke solo that was done in real time, because we all know that some of the funniest moments in the world are the synced drum solos of the 1930s and 40s, where it doesn't match. In fact, there's some with Sonny Greer where you just seem kind of laughing because it's just it's just kind of crazy. So I'd like to recommend that to people too. Before we get back to the music, Nick, you've talked about this in previous episodes, but for someone who may not have seen those sections, could you just tell us briefly about what instrument Alan Roos is playing at this time?
Sure. Alan's playing an archtop acoustic guitar. So very similar, in fact, to the one that's hanging on the wall behind me. So it is a instrument that has a graduated carved top. It has F holes like a cello or a contrabass. And it has a very different sound than the typical kind of flat top with a round hole guitar that most people think of when they think of as an acoustic guitar. And it was pretty much the standard band rhythm instrument from, let's say, 1930 until the end of the guitar chair in big band, the big band era. More specifically, Alan played a 16-inch Epiphone, which, once again, that's what's hanging on the wall behind me. Very likely recommended by his mentor and teacher, George Van Epps, who was an early adopter and user of Epiphone acoustic archtops. And Alan continued to use Epiphones for the first couple of years that he was playing with Benny. And I've talked a little bit in prior episodes, and I'll talk some more about it in the future, about how guitars increased in size during these years, because it's kind of interesting. We're jumping right in where guitars had a standard size of the lower bout being 16 inches wide. And over a quick succession of years, that grows 2 inches, which is kind of a big deal in guitar terms. But at this point in time, Alan's using a fantastic instrument. The Epiphones from this era are excellent instruments. George Van Epps used one, Dick McDonough used one, and of course, Alan Roos used one.
Thanks, Nick. And now we're going to go to the St. Louis Blues, our next track from the Thesaurus Sessions. Well, I think it's fair to say, in the context of what we've heard so far, that's one of the more unimaginative arrangements. One standard voicing for the band the whole time. There's hardly any counterpoint really to speak of. Not particularly interestingly voiced, or melodies, or harmonies, or anything. But not bad. I have no idea who wrote it. It says here in Russ Connor's wonderful discography, Joe Lippman or Spud Murphy. I don't think it's Spud Murphy. I think Spud would have thrown something else in there. Maybe young Joe Lippman was trying to imitate Dean Kincaid. I'm not sure, but it's, again, in the context of these Goodman arrangements, it's pedestrian. But a fascinating performance, and I'll just kick it over to you guys with just one comment that, you know, in the early choruses, Benny played a solo. There was a little bit of trumpet there. Probably Pee Wee Irwin, hard to say, but just very, very brief. The trombone, it was kind of interesting. But what I liked early on were there were a couple of moments like where the band would all play together, ba 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 ba, and then there'd be a hole, and you'd hear that guitar and bass and drums just fill up that little space with just a perfect little fills that were just so. Not even fills, just kind of like what Nick calls, I guess you call that straightening out the time. Just, you know, straight chug time. And just fascinating.
That arrangement sounded to me like the band was reading the arrangement and not adding a lot to it. Like maybe they just weren't very inspired by what they were reading. He was doing a good professional job of reading it down, and including Gene. He didn't really have too much to say on there besides the Sammy Weiss style press rolls almost all the way through it. It sounded to me like he stayed in 2/4 on the bass drum when Harry Goodman went to 4/4, which is kind of a nice effect. It keeps the rhythm section from being overloaded with 4/4. I think Frank Frobo was probably just playing boom, chuck, boom, chuck, boom, chuck. That's what it sounded like anyway. Harry Goodman had the most variety on there of any of the rhythm section players until the very end when Gene came in with the hi-hat. And maybe he thought to himself, this needs something. It's just not going anywhere. I'm going to do something and wake them up. But as you said, it was not a very inspired arrangement or performance, frankly.
Nick? It's interesting from a guitar perspective. You know, I on that last track we listened to, I talked about how relaxed and maybe a little bit reserved Alan Roos's playing was. Here, you know, we hear moving a little bit towards the opposite direction, where it's very strong, it's very assertive. He's emphasizing that 2 and 4 of the measure that we've talked about before. It's a little bit more of a crisper snap in his right hand playing, so you get that kind of, you know, chang or jink or chunk or however you want to characterize it. A little bit more of a drum sounding strum, if you will. And he does alternate quite a bit over the course of the tune between emphasizing the 2 and 4 and playing that kind of more straight rhythm. And does so in pretty subtle ways that you kind of have to, you know, second guess your ears to see like, oh, what exactly is he doing through there? And I think it's a good example of just the ability of a rhythm guitarist of this era, particularly someone as fantastic as Alan Roos, to vary things a little bit, even while the rest of the arrangement and the rest of the performance is maybe a little unremarkable in a lot of ways. There's still something interesting going on in the rhythm chair.
So let's go to the next track, and this is Indiana. Well, that was a lively one. Indiana, and arrangement is kind of uncredited, but it sounds like Spud Murphy to me. But really exciting. A lot of rhythm section stuff there. Great solo work, a little bit from Pee Wee Irwin, it sounds like. Art Rollini on the tenor, and Benny, of course, on the clarinet. But man, Gene Krupa was all over the place. And just funny to hear that right after that St. Louis Blues, and they went right into that. So, Hal, what you got?
Yeah, Gene started the tune off by playing the hi-hat again, getting it underway right away, as opposed to playing press rolls and building up to the hi-hat. That was really kind of exciting. And it sounded like, once again, he was playing two-beat on the bass drum instead of all four. And it's an unusual sound, but he figured out how to do that to make it propulsive without playing 4/4 on both instruments. He was really good at setting up those breaks in the arrangement. There's a lot of unusual spots for breaks in that arrangement. I think generally when the three of us have played it, there's no breaks. You just play it straight through, and whoever arranged that let everybody have a little bit of a solo break. And I heard Alan Roos very prominently there early on, and of course Benny and the other horns. I heard a little bit of Zutty Singleton from Gene. I think I heard a couple of whacks on the tom-tom and a figure on the snare drum that Zutty played. But he kept himself in check pretty much, but he still really played a driving style on that whole performance.
There's one thing I wonder if you could talk about. You've mentioned it previously, but maybe this is a good time to go into it, which is about, the evolution of the relatively legato, shushing hi-hat beat. And maybe I'm just remembering something that Whitney Balliet wrote once or something like that, but I think that the adjective he used for Chick Webb's hi-hat was imperious. And it seems like, Chick Webb's hi-hat beat was, I don't know how to describe it, like big, and it was...
Uh-huh.
It was a big darn thing.
Right.
Of course, Joe Jones's is in a sense smaller, and it may actually have to do, with the, this is not Senior Wenceslas, it might have something to do, with how far apart the cymbals are when you strike them. But Gene there, and again, this is June 1935. He's only been with the band 6 months. The hi-hat sound there was almost atypical for him, from what I think of him like in 37, 38, 40, where like maybe Joe Jones had really patented that thing, and so drummers went far out of their way not to do it, Buddy Rich being the most 180-degree example of a, like he never opened the damn thing back in those days. What can you make of all that for us?
The people who were playing hi-hat early on, like in the early 1930s, you hear Benny Washington in Chicago with Earl Hines, and later Jimmy Noon, or hear Walter Johnson with Fletcher Henderson. You hear the backbeat. Chick Webb, to my ears, played very similar to that. I'm sure that's a lot of what was influencing Gene to play it the way he did. But as you described, it's a big sound as opposed to more of a wave sound like Joe Jones played. And he influenced Sid Catlett and Shelly Manne, Maury Feld, and other drummers who didn't play it with such a there's not as much definition on the second and fourth beat. It's more like what Freddie Green described as the rhythm wave. That's how I hear the later iteration of hi-hat. But early on, it was still fulfilling the function of a choke cymbal, where in the out chorus in 1928, you would have played there, he played it's accenting the second and fourth beats, but it's a different percussion instrument, and you're hearing more beats on the hi-hat than you would have heard on a cymbal. Earlier we heard Gene go out playing an open crash cymbal, just dampening it at the very end of the crash. That's kind of the function of the hi-hat when you play it that way, is it accents 2 and 4, but it's a different sound from playing with a stick under the cymbal or just damping it with your hand. But Gene hadn't developed fully the way he was going to play hi-hat when he's playing it here.
Well, I first of all have a question for Hal, another cymbal question. There was a cymbal crash. I think I heard it twice on that recording. And, you know, a contemporary drummer might affect the same sound by using, you know, a cymbal with rivets on it. Do you know what I'm talking about? It was a long, protracted splash. Would that just have been a smaller splash cymbal that he just hit and let ring? Do you know what I'm talking about on that one break?
That could be. I also heard him choke some of them off very short. Yeah. It sounded almost like Sammy Weiss on some of the earlier things that we listened to. But the one that rang, we know he used a splash cymbal. At one point he had it mounted upside down on his bass drum rim. Later he had it right in the center of the bass drum, but it was a smaller diameter cymbal. The one that we heard just now sounded like a larger, like maybe a 10-inch splash cymbal. That could have been upside down on the bass drum rim, and he just reached over and tapped it and let it go. I know what you're saying there about the totally different sound. It could have been that, or it could have been one of his other smaller cymbals, because drummers weren't playing big cymbals yet.
Right.
Probably the biggest cymbal he had at that point would have been 14 or 15 inches.
Yeah. You had that great quote in the last show about something he wrote in a drum column about a 16-inch cymbal. Yes. It was like, a monster had arrived, and
driving an armored truck through the front window of Macy's.
Right. Well, all right. Let's go to the fourth selection from this session, and this is I think one of Spud Murphy's best, or at least one of the ones I like the most, and it's "I Surrender Dear." And Benny just seemed to be really inspired on this tune, plays the hell out of it. And so here it is. absolute magic. It's hard to know, what adjectives to put to that kind of music. What is it? Okay, it's beautiful music. It's a beautiful tune and a beautiful arrangement. Does it fit into what we would think of 1935 jazz? Not as an arrangement. The playing on it, there's some of the greatest jazz playing of 1935 on the record by Benny Goodman. But it's so intelligently written and so beautifully voiced and so much counterpoint and so much just the little details of the harmony and the voicing and all those things. And it really is kind of magical in a kind of way. And yet it's, I'm going to focus on what's great about it, not maybe about what's difficult for people to appreciate about it. Now that's what we're going to bring to it by our enthusiasm, I guess. The floor is open, gents, whoever wants to take it.
Well, I'll jump in and talk a little bit about Alan Roos and some really interesting things we heard on that record, and some real anomalies as far as guitar playing on jazz band records of this era or any. We did hear some of those higher voiced guitar chords that I've talked a little bit about, which is a bit different from what we hear from Alan Roos on later Benny Goodman records. From a guitar standpoint, it helps you get a sense of how to voice things and how to mix up your voicings over the course of an arrangement to keep some variance and keep some movement in reaction and in support of the other things that are going on with the arrangement. Again, that relaxed feel that we've talked about a fair amount on this listening session is there again, and it's kind of like perfectly placed this time. Whereas before it may have felt like it was perhaps the guitar was taking a little bit too much of a back seat or just never quite matched up. It was just like the perfect feel for this arrangement. And at one point in time, Roos played this very staccato guitar figure, staccato arpeggiated guitar figure of eighth notes that I can't remember hearing anything like that on any other record around this time or before or after in this context. The end effect is almost like a plucked violin. It had that great just kind of staccato and yeah, exactly. And the same kind of decay of the note, which made me think that he was perhaps muting the guitar with his picking hand. Which if he's doing what I think he was doing is a pretty involved technique that, you kind of don't hear until the advent of electric instruments and the guitars start struggling with ways to control the dynamics that electricity brings to the instrument. So that was quite a surprise. And to your point, Loren, that was just such beautiful music. It was just a joy to listen to. I could listen to that all day, every day.
Well, actually, after we get through with Hal, we are going to hear two more versions of it. So we can listen for, we can listen for what Roos does. And I'm not sure if Van Epps is on one, but we'll see who it is, but what they do on another version. And B, also to hear what Jess Stacy will do with the obligatos to Benny in place of Frank Rupp, who's doing a wonderful job. I mean, clearly he feels that he's supposed to answer and respond to Benny, and he's doing it in his own fashion. The figure you're talking about, I believe it's the second half of a bridge.
Yes.
And I think it was the second chorus. I'm not sure. It's definitely not the first chorus, and I don't think it's the last chorus. So somewhere in the middle there, it was the second half of the bridge where those unusual guitar sounds came in. Hal, did you have anything to add on this one?
Oh, sure. Everybody on that particular song sounded like they were enjoying playing. It just had a real lift to it and a life, vitality that you don't hear on some of these stock arrangements. But I guess Spud Murphy could really bring out the best in great musicians like that. I noticed right away Gene Krupa was playing rolls with the brush. You can hear it right at the top of the song. And as we've discussed before, that's one of the most difficult things you can do, one of the most difficult techniques to make work on a snare drum. And he even sounded less precise on that than he did on the previous time that we heard it. It wasn't out of control, but when the sticks, you don't have sticks to bounce and you're just trying to bounce all those wires, and considering how brushes were constructed back then with really small and thin metal handles, you can buy bigger brushes now and give yourself some weight in your hands if you try to do that. But the fact that he could do it at all with the 1935 brushes is pretty amazing. And he did it again later in the song. Didn't overdo it. He used it as a spice, just to grab your attention for a minute, and then it was gone and back to timekeeping. And once again, as on previous recordings, he did the open crash cymbal on the last bridge, but not at the end of the song. It's just kind of like peaks and valleys. He brought the intensity up here and then backed it off again and let the rest of the band take it out. Yeah. And what a great rhythm section. They just worked together like clockwork, everybody very loose and relaxed. And Alan Roos able to play those figures that Nick mentioned. And Frobo was relaxed enough to play the echo to Benny. That was a fantastic performance. It's a great tune anyway. It's a lot of fun to play, and it sounded like those guys were having the time of their life.
Yeah. Later on, Benny he never recorded this arrangement commercial. He did a sextet version with Charlie Christian, and then there's a trio version that came out as part of the MGM Treasure Chest series, I believe. But this arrangement never got recorded. As he really kind of started to phase out the Spud Murphy arrangements once we get back to the studio arrangements. He still has some of them. You know what? Why don't we hear 2 broadcast performances of I Surrender Dear, since we love the arrangement so much, and we'll listen and see how much guitar is captured there. The second one is from Let's Dance, 34, 35, I guess it's in 35. Then we'll hear one from the Congress Hotel. So there's no flutes in the band anymore, and it'll be interesting to hear how they do it. And we should mention, all the ensemble work was gorgeous, but the 2 trombones at the beginning, Jack Lacey and Red Ballard, that was just, full and beautifully blended. And but Lyle Spud Murphy, it's interesting. He also got into 12-tone composition later, taught and arranged all kinds of relatively esoteric things. A fascinating figure. Okay, let's hear his I Surrender Dear 2 times.
lots of guitar on that track, and how wonderful that was to hear it ringing out like that. In fact, the last chorus, I think there was more ring to the strings than I've heard on just about anything else we've played. And I can't say too much about the drums because the surface noise kind of overpowered the drumming, but it sounded like Gene was playing pretty much the same routine with the brush rolls and the open crash cymbal on the last bridge, and basically keeping time on brushes all the way through, doing a marvelous job. But the piano was a little bit under wraps, didn't play out quite as much. Bass was doing his usual great job, but my attention was just drawn to the guitar all the way through. And I'm very curious what Nick's going to have to say about that.
Well, Nick's very curious about what Nick's going to have to say about that.
And I'm curious also about what Nick's going to say, because now that I know that you know that I know that you know. Okay, I know that you know. Come on.
It's interesting. When I first started listening to the track, I was like, okay, that's Roos. But midway through the track, I started changing my mind. And there was something slightly different about the playing that we haven't heard on recent sides that made me kind of start thinking back about Van Epps. You're right. There was a really relaxed feel. The chords were ringing out. And this is something I haven't really talked about before, which is, when you play the guitar, you've got two hands at work. And part of the job of your left hand, which is fretting the notes on the neck of the guitar, is you're controlling the pressure on the strings. And what that does is it's kind of like it's like a pedal on a piano for sustain, where, if less pressure is going to let the strings ring out, and more pressure is going to give it more of a choked, muted sound, less decay on the note. And so, there's a way to stay rhythmic and play those quarter notes and let those chords ring out a little bit more. And the overall effect is, it sounds a little less terse, a little less like a drum, perhaps, a little bit like a snap, and more kind of like what people typically think of a ringing guitar chord. And there's something about that playing that was making me lean towards Van Epps, and not only the way he was approaching those chords, but also the way he was incorporating some of those arpeggiated figures into chords. And that was, something I talked about before a few episodes ago, about a big part of the Van Epps technique of trying to, he eventually would call it his lap piano, of trying to figure out a way to play piano type figures on a guitar, and blending single note lines into chords and tying those chords together and harmonically tying what he's playing all together. And we heard a lot of that. And as I said before, Roos was a student of Van Epps and took those ideas kind of to the next level. And, anyone that knows Roos's playing on the later 30s records, with like Paul Whiteman and Jack Teagarden, as well as his things in the 40s with Harry James, will know that like Roos really perfected this approach of tying together chords with single notes, in what, like I said, what Van Epps would think of it in a more pianistic manner. So my curiosity, Loren, is what does the discography say? Who do they claim it is?
Well, you put your finger on the problem. This is February 2nd, I believe, February 2nd, 1935. But the issue is that the discography, the amazing work that Russ Connor did, and that other people have done in his wake, is that, no one knows who was there that night. No one knows. And so we can go from personnel's, from a record date that was a month later. We can go from the music magazines that will say sometimes, Bunny Berrigan passed out and so filled in for him, or not that literally, but things like that. The truth is, no one knows. And I was going to, so all we can do is make an educated guess. Now, I was going to throw out, maybe it's not Roos or Van Epps. And why not? On a Saturday night, it's certainly possible. Right? Chances are that it is them. You hear it, of course, chances are that it is, but there's always that chance that it's not. You know what I mean? And so that's when we go to someone like you who knows them intimately, and says, well, based on what you heard, is that possible? Then you say, well, no, it's not. And like we would trust each other, as musicians with what we hear. So according to the discography, it's Van Epps. But and I think you even mentioned in a much earlier show that that Roos was starting to either fill in or sub or something like that. And it was a Saturday night. Maybe there was a Ray Noble rehearsal or a record date or who knows what. So based on your judgment, who is it?
I'm going to go with Van Epps.
Okay.
I changed my mind midway through listening to the track.
Right.
And I felt that there was enough George there to make me feel comfortable in saying George.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. And I want to go back to something that Hal said not several shows, but many shows ago. When we were talking about Benny Goodman's kind of fully formed. By what point is he 100% the Benny Goodman of the 30s? Or, I mean, in his most, his greatness. And and we all have different years. Remember, Hal said, and I take your point. Well, really, almost his very first solo. Waiting for Katie, Indeed I Do, and those very early Ben Pock. It's really all there, and clarinetitis and all those things. And it was just a matter of maybe he was 17, 18 years old. It was just a matter of spending a few more years on the instrument to get to that superhuman level that he got to. But I'll tell you something, especially just on these two I Surrender Dears. It's just what he would have played in years to come. I mean, there's I don't know. I can't wrap it up with a bow on it, but it's just some of his greatest playing that I've heard so far in so many ways. Phenomenal.
Don't you think he played better and better as he got more inspired by the people working with him too? Like this?
Absolutely. Of course. Absolutely. And then there came a tipping point of control and generation. But at this point, yeah, sure, things are like this, and they're all the same age, and there's still guys in the band that can tell them to go jump in the lake, and it's peers. So let's go to same arrangement, the last version that we have. And by the way, I think I have a possible reason why he didn't record it. It's almost 4.5 minutes long. And it was such a beautiful piece that maybe he just didn't want to cut it, because they would have had to cut out a third of it or something to get it on a record in those days. So maybe that's why. I don't know. We'll never know. All right, so this is the band. They're already on the way. It's the same band. Well, Jess Stacy's on the piano. And let's go to it, and we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay.
Ellen Ward and the band go to town on the words and music of Yankee Doodle Never Went to Town.
Well, that was an interesting comparison. From a guitar perspective, it was maybe the least interesting of the three versions we listened to, with Roos playing it the most straight. Although he did something yet different in this version, which was play some offbeat notes that anticipated the next chord, which we haven't heard too much of, or at least we haven't heard it very clearly. I thought it was an interesting version. I definitely am leaning towards the Rhythm Makers version is my favorite of the three we listened to today. Although all were played really, really well, there was something really special about that first version that we heard, I think. But otherwise, the rhythm section, we heard a lot of the same things that we heard from Alan Roos on the Rhythm Makers section. Some higher voiced chords, or chords that are voiced higher up the neck, that give almost kind of like a lute or ukulele type sound at times, where it doesn't quite sound like a guitar. It sounds like a higher pitched stringed instrument, and great rhythm feel throughout. But that Rhythm Makers version was definitely something special.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the band had changed. I think the chart had its time. Again, this air check that we just heard is from the Congress Hotel. I miss the flutes. Mm-hmm. I don't like hearing those parts played an octave down by saxophones. When I say I don't like it, what I mean is that it's, the way that Spud Murphy envisioned it in his mind was with flutes and certain octaves and certain tempos. And here, also we should mention that the lead trombonist is Murray McEachern, who plays it very differently from Jack Lacey. More in your face, kind of, just stronger, louder. How about that? There's a neutral technical word, but it's louder than Jack Lacey played it, and he attacks it in a different way. Little alto solo there by, I assume, Jaime Schertzer. I kind of know his playing well enough to say that was him. If you would ask me, to bet $100, were there any Jaime Schertzer solos with Goodman before 1943, I would have said no. So there we go. There's one. And it brings up another point. Well, also, something about that arrangement that we hear more clearly on the previous ones are sforzandos and certain kind of dynamic markings that are really noticeably absent from what we think of the Benny Goodman band of this period. They don't do sforzandos, and what that means for folks is like a note that starts soft and gets very loud, or starts loud down, boom, all those kind of things. The Goodman band wasn't into that. You rarely hear it. It's loud, it's soft, it's somewhere in the middle, but they don't do these kind of like explosions of more subtle dynamics, to be frank with you. And that's neither good nor bad. I think it's just a factual statement. And this chart, going back to the Rhythm Makers version, has wonderful dynamics that obviously Spud Murphy wrote into the charts. I've seen a lot of the original parts, Ellington, Basie, Goodman, and Dorsey. I've seen the actual original arrangements, and not many times the scores, but I've seen a lot of the parts, and it's fun. It's interesting, and specifically Ellington. There's no dynamics. The players just intuited what to do. The band leader would go, shh, okay, so you play that part quiet. But rarely will you see, piano, mezzo piano, sforzando, or, the players might pencil in certain phrasing things. But very rarely dynamics. They just knew what to do with it. But clearly that chart, as Spud Murphy wrote it, was full of dynamics because they do it consistently. But it also brings up the point that I wouldn't have thought about without hearing the late 36 bit, excuse me, not late 36, the spring of 1936, late winter of 36. I don't have I'll get the date of that air check here. It's early 1936 from the Congress Hotel. And, okay, so there's an edit. I won't take the time to look it up. Wait, let me just get it. As long as I got myself there, I'll get oh, here it is. Oh. Get myself out of this hole. Okay, January 20th, 36. All right. But what really brought it to mind, was hearing this version from January 26, 1936. I mean, it's not that long after, actually, the versions that we heard. It's just half a year or so. But what's interesting is that the Goodman Band, as it evolved to become the classic Victor thing, their ballads, they never had a reflective romantic feeling to them. They played their ballads differently, the way that Benny wanted it, the way that Jimmy Mundy and Fletcher Henderson and the other arrangers wrote for the band. I don't know what the right words are, but it wasn't reflective, romantic. What the hell does romantic mean in this context? But it was more like swing dancing slow songs. I don't know how to describe it. Maybe you guys can help me put words to it. But even Basie's band, with Good Morning Blues, got into a certain kind of nostalgic. Again, these are all my adjectives, but a certain kind of more complicated or something like that mood. Is what I'm saying making any sense to you guys? Because I don't know whether I'm off on the deep end of the pool here. But
no, I think that performance we just heard had a much harder edge to it than the previous two. And part of that was the rhythm section. They seemed to be pushing a little bit more and not laying back as they did with the rhythm makers. The guitar wasn't ringing as much. The bass started in 4/4 on that last one instead of starting in 2. It was a little difficult to hear the drums until the last bridge, but I suspect he found a formula that worked and just stayed with it. And Jeff Stacey started to play a little bit under the first chorus and then backed off. But the whole thing just had less of what we talked about several shows ago as the wide beat. Room to breathe in the horns and the rhythm section. That a little bit of 2-beat, I think, would have made that performance we just heard more ballad-like instead of let's get this over with, which was the general impression I had with that.
Yeah.
Well, and Loren, to pick up your point about some of those later Goodman ballad performances, the word that springs to my mind is atmospheric, in that they lack the kind of atmosphere one associates with a ballad, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it's not that the band was incapable of doing so, and the kind of the argument I point to for that is a small group recording, something like Stardust, which comes at the tail end of this period we're talking about. The Stardust recording. Even though the one with Charlie Christian as kind of a very late example, they certainly were capable of whatever that extra special mood it was kind of expected of a band to provide for a ballad. But it's just Benny chose not to inflect that into his recordings of ballads, and whether that was direct conversations with the arrangers, whether it was conscious choices about the arrangements that it was recording, or how he instructed the band in the moment at the recording sessions. We don't know entirely, but I hear what you're saying, and I think there's maybe a little bit of extra sentimentality that other band leaders imbue on their ballad performances, but certainly it is this kind of mix of dynamics and mood and even textures to some extent.
Well, yeah, and I think the bands in those days, and this is very good to focus on it. Dorsey had his thing, Lunsford had his thing, and the band leaders were really looking for a consistent approach to things. And Dorsey certainly had a consistent approach to ballads with Alex Stordahl, early on Paul Weston. And then later on, also, like his ballad things. In fact, Dorsey wasn't really consistent. Benny's band was more consistent across the board, everything they played. Whereas Dorsey really had two different styles. He had that ballad, Axel Stordahl style. He had the Dixielandish kind of 36, 37 style. Then you get into, when Bill Finnegan and, well, he's only there for a second, but, when the later arrangers come in, and Cy Oliver, that totally changes. And to your point, Nick, I'm just wondering, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's my impression that the small groups, the trio and quartet, didn't play for dancing. Now, I don't know what happened in a ballroom, but the way I see it, like at the Manhattan Room, was that they would wheel out the vibes, and Gene would come down front, and they would play their trio and quartet numbers for people to listen to. So I'm wondering, if I was there dancing to the Goodman Band one night in 1936 or 37, and I wanted to have a nice romantic, slow song to dance to, I might not have had it, and so yeah, it's just interesting because I've always felt that, even you took the words right out of my heart. All those slower tunes of the Goodman Band in 37, with the Martha Tilton vocals, most of them. They're still, and it goes back to your comments about the rhythm section. The rhythm section has that Goodman, Alan Roos, Gene Krupa thing that they're doing, and it doesn't allow for this. And that's not a negative comment. That's not what Benny wanted, and God bless him. You know what I mean? He got it with the small groups, and that's fine. But it's just funny how we can riff off of just one performance into all these various things. We've come to the end of another one of our series on the Thesaurus Sessions, the Rhythm Maker Sessions, Benny Goodman, June 6, 1935. We'll be back. So thank you, Hal Smith. Thank you, Nick Rossi. I'm Loren Schoenberg, and until we meet again.